Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mindflow's monthly webinar series. My name is Anthony Fareno. I'm the co-founder of Mindflow, and I'm joined by one of our very own sports psychologists, Dr. Megan Pietrucha. As you all know, we're going to be talking about mindfulness today, which is just such an incredibly important topic within not only the sports performance realm, but also the wellness realm. You hear about this whether you're in general therapy or working with a sports psychologist. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited. I'm really excited to dive into this presentation with Megan. Couple housekeeping items before we kick things off. The first is if you're not too familiar with Mindflow, I want to have a shameless plug real quick. So Mindflow is an organization that is sports psychology driven, and what we do is we partner with athletic departments to give their student athletes, give their coaches access to our team of sports psychologists, which are all over the country, like Megan. And so if you have an interest in bringing our services to campus, whether you're an athlete, an athletic trainer, a coach, you name it, we can help you guys out. So our website is thisismindflow.com. I'll put that in the chat so you can have access to it and click on it if you want to poke around. And there's a contact form on there that you can access. But enough of that. The other housekeeping item that we have is at the end of today's webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. I found in the past that when people and attendees and athletes are engaged with the Q&A and submitting really good questions, it makes for really, really good dialogue. So please, if you have a question, submit it. You'll notice a Q&A emblem on your screen. And what we'll do is we'll address all those questions at the end of today's webinar. And chances are, if you have a question, another person has the same question. So please feel free to send those off, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. But without further ado, I will pass it off to Dr. Megan Pietrucha.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony. Hi, everyone. I am Megan. I am a licensed clinical and sports psychologist. I am located currently outside of Chicago, so in the Chicagoland area. I am formerly a college athlete myself, and I've been with Mindflow for about almost 2 years now. So I'm excited to be here to talk about mindfulness. It's a tool and a skill that I feel like I wish I would have used more in my experience being an athlete, but definitely have utilized it since. And use it a lot in the work that I do. I work with individual athletes. I also specialize in working with eating concerns and eating disorders. So we use it a lot in the individual work that I do with those folks as well. So thank you for being here. One other housekeeping item I did want to mention is that after today's webinar, there will be some handouts for you. So those will get sent to you. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Anthony or I, or as Anthony mentioned, throw those questions in the chat and we'd love to get a conversation started. So let's jump in. So mindfulness for athletes, and hopefully you can all see the slides here. Mindfulness for athletes. And this is mindfulness, not only for your sport, but as Anthony has mentioned, this is a skill that goes well beyond the court field. Your experience as an athlete can be utilized for a lot of different reasons, and particularly for, mood regulation. It's exceptionally helpful. So we'll talk a little bit about those things. So I do have a lot of information to share with you, and then we're going to do some exercises too as we go along. So hopefully there'll be some experiential pieces that you can take with you. And like I said, I'm going to throw kind of the kitchen sink of like intro to mindfulness at you and let us know if you have any questions. So here's the agenda. We're going to go through what is mindfulness and talk a little bit about like, why does it work? How does it work? Some of the biological bases, go over kind of like bio 101 with you about like what's going on in your brain and your body and how mindfulness is useful, so that, we can kind of bust some myths about it being a little bit, some people feel like it's a little too like woo woo, let's om together, which, some mindfulness is like that. But really there's some really good science behind it, and you should know what's happening in your brain and your body and why it's helpful, especially when it comes to sport. So we'll do some exercises. There's a list of exercises we'll go through, and then we'll wrap up with some Q&A, and let you go on your way. So let's dive in. So what is mindfulness? So I'll get on the same page. So mindfulness, if you're not familiar with it, I think most people at this point are probably somewhat familiar with it in one way, shape, or form. But here's the definition of it. And this comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is kind of like the guru of mindfulness. He is the founder of MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a form of therapy, as you can imagine, for stress, but has been broadly used for other things as well. So mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. Or in other words, knowing what you are doing while you are doing it. So let's break that down for a second. So paying attention, right? It's focused. On purpose, it's intentional. In the present moment, in the here and now. We're not thinking about the past. We're not worried about the future. We're right here. And non-judgmentally, we're trying to suspend kind of that inner critic, the tendency, the human tendency to judge. And that often is maybe one of the harder components with mindfulness. So we'll talk a little bit about that, especially when it comes to mindfulness of thoughts and trying to not be kind of your own worst critic, right? Like beating yourself up. But that's the definition of mindfulness. So there's a couple different components. And as we go through these exercises, you'll hear these again and again and again, kind of hammering it home. So why does mindfulness work for athletes, but why does it work in general? Well, a couple things. It improves attention and concentration when we're focused on the here and now, right? We're kind of zoned in. And as you can imagine, it can help facilitate finding the zone or flow. So when you're utilizing these skills, right, like that, that ever-present kind of like search for finding the flow every time we compete, mindfulness can definitely help you with that. It helps to regulate our emotion. So if you're someone who, when you're competing, you feel like, if something happens, a curveball, literally or figuratively, gets thrown in your direction, and you get kind of activated. Either you get down on yourself or you get too amped up, right? Mindfulness can help you, again, find that kind of like sweet spot with regulating your emotions in a way that helps improve performance. And as you can see over to the side there, that graph, I'm sure you've seen this before, the Yerkes-Dodson bell curve. It's the relationship between arousal, so physiological arousal, emotional arousal, and performance. And the key there is to find that sweet spot, that green dot right in the middle, right? The optimal arousal and optimal performance. So we want to find that place where we're regulating our emotions. We're like activated enough, right? Like we're amped up enough, but not too much, because once we get too much, we start to kind of like maybe get the yips or get the jitters, right? And if we're not activated enough, we just don't have enough energy going to perform at our best. So this is how mindfulness can help us kind of get to this place of optimal performance. It reduces stress. As I mentioned, Jon Kabat-Zinn has operationalized the concept of mindfulness into MBSR for stress reduction. And there's many studies out there, if you want to look it up, if you're interested in that thing, about how this affects our stress and our ability to regulate stress, cortisol, adrenaline, all those kind of chemicals that run through our bodies. It reduces our reactivity to negative thoughts. So as I mentioned, if you're someone who, maybe gets too amped up and then you get in your own head, right? Mindfulness can kind of bring that down a notch, especially with that non-judgmental piece. If you're practicing that, that's what kind of takes the edge off of the negative thoughts, because the negative thoughts, it doesn't mean that they won't come. They'll still come, but they won't stick, right? They won't like hook you in and then like tank your performance from there. I'm sure many of you have had that experience. I know I have, as a, in competition, where it's like once the negative thoughts come, it's like you can't get rid of them and you're like, oh my God, I just want this to end. So, mindfulness can help with that, reducing negative thoughts. There's also evidence that it reduces pain and fatigue, right? We know that rest days are important. If you're doing it mindfully and you're practicing mindfulness, it can help with pain management. So if you're rehabbing from an injury, right? Another way in which mindfulness can be really helpful, and just with management of fatigue in general, and it improves immune system functioning, right? So again, like seasons are long, competition seasons are long when you're traveling and trying to do school and having a social life and, family and, work, whatever, you name it. When you have your plate is so full as a student athlete, so staying healthy is critical, right? We're not going to perform well when we're not healthy, unless you're Michael Jordan, having a flu game. Um, but you want to stay healthy, right? So this is how mindfulness can be helpful. So how does mindfulness work? As I mentioned, it improves that mind-body connection, the brain and the body. It regulates stress and anxiety by engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So we'll go into like a little bit of the bio bases of this. And it engages different areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. When we're getting all amped up and we start to get carried away with our emotions, especially when, well, whether it's on the field or off the field, when we get carried away, the part of the brain that's really activated is called the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain. And to unhook from that, right? Mindfulness, the reason why that's helpful is it starts to engage your prefrontal cortex, or the frontal part of your brain and your frontal lobes, where you're thinking, you're judging, you're planning, you have more of kind of a regulated experience, right? So that's how in the brain, how mindfulness is working. It's kind of lighting up and firing different parts of the brain to manage that emotional arousal. Sorry about that. So as I mentioned, the stress response, right? This is kind of an old handout. It may still exist on the internet somewhere, but I utilize this a lot in the therapy work that I do to kind of explain this, the parasympathetic and then the nervous system basically response, and how mindfulness is helpful to regulate your nervous system. So what's happening, right, is when we get activated, our brains are interesting, because even though we think we've evolved as a species over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, really our brains, there's a center in our brain that we call like the reptilian brain, and it responds to stressors, imagined and real stressors, in the same way that it always has, right? Like we get activated, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And the system um, involved in that is the sympathetic nervous system. So when we experience threat, danger, or stress, our stress response, boop, starts to get activated, right? And that is our sympathetic nervous system. And so, right, if our sympathetic nervous system is constantly firing, we have all this cortisol, the stress hormone, just pulsing through our bodies and our brains, and it's hard to bring that down. And what we need to do, and that's just like an instinctual response, right? It's a survival mechanism. So that's why it's there. Um, and what we need to do in order to regulate that is we have to kind of take our foot off of the gas pedal and pump the brake. And the brake is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the system responsible for regulating stress, for down-regulating that kind of emotional and the physiological response with cortisol and all those kind of neurochemicals going through our bodies. It's bringing our stress response back down. So the parasympathetic nervous system, the reason why deep breathing is helpful is because we're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. It again balances out our nervous system and gives us that kind of relaxation or that relief that we're seeking, right? And then, the more we engage in the parasympathetic response, that's why the immune system functioning is implicated, right? So, because we're not kind of taxing our bodies in a stressful way. So if there's any questions about that, feel free to jump in and share in the chat if you have any questions. As I mentioned, it's a really complicated system, but I kind of like made it as simple as possible so that you kind of understand what's happening in your brain and your body, and why mindfulness is helpful, how it's helpful. So let's jump into some exercises. Um, the first exercise that I want to emphasize is like so the concept of mindfulness, right, is really like most people get it. They're like, yeah, sounds good, right? Like makes sense why this would be helpful. How do I do it, right? Like sometimes a lot of people feel like it's easier said than done, which it is a lot of the times. But the simplest way of practicing mindfulness and bringing mindfulness into your everyday life and your sports performance is utilizing mindful breathing. Breathing is a tool that is simple, it's effective, you can do it anywhere, anytime, right? And it's effective in slowing your nervous system and reducing stress. So this is a tool that can anchor you and help you regulate at any moment in our day. The trick is we have to be, again, intentional about it, right? So the more we remember to do it, just like exercising a muscle, right? The more we remember to do it, the more effective it's going to become. So the easiest way to think about breath awareness, and if you have an Apple Watch, you can also utilize that, right? It has the mindful reminders on there if are into that. But the easiest way to do it is to kind of just tune into your body, right? Like reminders to tune in. We're so used to kind of tuning out in our everyday world with everything going on and stress and everything. It's a shift to tune inward, right? And the breath can help you do that. So let's start with a breath awareness meditation. And if you'd like to participate in this, you can feel free to do so. I'll just walk you through the meditation. And it'll only be a couple moments. And that's the kind of key with mindful breathing is that it doesn't have to be like a 20-minute, 30-minute meditative experience, right? Like you don't have to kind of for 30 minutes. All you really have to do is pay attention to the breath, to tune in rather than out. So let's do a quick mindful breathing exercise. So if you'd like to participate, you can close your eyes or focus on one point in the room. Get comfortable in your chair, in your seat, wherever you're at. If you're sitting, kind of ground your sit bones, kind of like feel the weight of your body through your butt into your legs, ground your feet on the floor. If you're laying or kind of comfortable, ground yourself into whatever surface you're laying or sitting on. And don't try to change the rhythm of your breathing. Just notice it. Gently pay attention to the rhythm of your breath. The inhale and the exhale. Take a moment to tune in. And if you notice that your mind begins to wander, that's okay. It's going to do that. That's natural. Gently bring it back. Just remind yourself, focus on the breath. And if you would like to deepen the breath, to practice engaging that parasympathetic nervous system that I talked about, you can take a deeper inhale if it feels comfortable. If it doesn't feel comfortable, stay right where you are. Just meet your body where it is. But if it feels comfortable to take a deeper inhale, go ahead and do so. Hold it for 2, 3, 4. And exhale. Push that breath out as far as you can. If you'd like to tune in even further, you can put your hand on your chest and one hand on your belly as you continue to breathe. And just notice, is your chest rising more or is your belly rising as you breathe? If you notice your chest is rising more, you're engaging in more of like a stressful breathing. When we're stressed, we breathe shallowly and from our chest. If you want to deepen the breath, breathe in through your diaphragm all the way down in your belly. Feel your belly expand with the in-breath and contract with the out-breath. You stay there for a couple more moments, tuning into the breath. If you've ever done yoga, which I'm sure many of you have, there's a form of breathing that can also engage the parasympathetic response, the relaxation response. And I think it's called lion's breath or ujjayi breathing. And it sounds a little funny, so this one you might not be able to do anywhere. But you could add, when you breathe in deeply. And then on the out breath, push the air up through the back of your throat and out, and it should make that kind of fiery dragon breath sound. And that will, again, deepen the relaxation, the engagement in the parasympathetic response. So take 1 or 2 more deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can start to wiggle your fingers and your toes and open your eyes and bring your eyes back to the room. So that is a mindful breathing exercise. It doesn't even have to be that complicated. You could just remind yourself to take a couple deep breaths when you start to feel body tension, or a physical sensation, or if you start to notice your mind racing. Right. Take a couple deep breaths. A lot of the times, the natural instinct that we will have, our nervous system will have, is to sigh under stress. I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed this in myself. Like when I'm really stressed, I'll sigh and people will be like, "Are you okay?" And I'd be like, "Yeah," but I didn't even realize I was doing it. And so being mindful of that, if you notice those kinds of responses, your body is telling you, slow it down, take a breath, right? So we did a couple of things. We did breath awareness, we did deep breathing. We did one form of the 4-7-8 breathing, which is, if you've heard of box breathing before, box breathing is kind of like even um, rhythmic breathing, like 4 in, 4 out, 6 in, 6 out, that kind of thing. 4-7-8 I like because it really focuses on that extended exhale, which is 4 count in, hold for 7, which is kind of a long time. So you could adjust that if you're not comfortable with the 7. You can hold it for like 5 or 6, just a little bit longer than the in breath. And then the extended out breath engages that parasympathetic nervous system. So if you like that, figuring out ways where that you can integrate that, right? Again, be intentional about it. Keep it in front of mind to try to do that more regularly. And I can guarantee you with time, you will start to feel the effects. You'll feel your brain slow down. You'll feel more regulated, more grounded. If you have interest in these exercises, there is a link here for you for future reference. If you'd like to, go and examine that, please feel free to take that and run with it. So I want to pause here and just encourage you to notice any other observations you had about that mindful breathing exercise. Was it difficult? Did you notice your mind wandering? Were you distracted? Did it feel good? Maybe it's a combination of a couple things. All of those things are okay. There is no right way, no wrong way to do mindfulness. So that's another fun thing about this is like, there's no right or wrong. You just do it, right? And you just notice, again, that gentle noticing versus judging. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you want to kind of jot down some of your observations so that if you go back and you practice this, you can note like where you started, right? And see if things change over time with some more practice. But again, if you notice you're feeling distracted or uncomfortable, that's okay, right? The first time we do anything, it's uncomfortable, right? I don't know about you guys, but like I played softball in college and I tried to be a switch hitter for a little while, which I was kind of like semi-successful at, ish. And the first time I ever turned around and tried to hit from the other side of the batter's box, how awkward, right? Like it did not come naturally. And the more I did it, right, the more you exercise it, the more natural it will become. So another way of practicing mindfulness and kind of engaging in that mind-body connection is to do a body scan meditation or to incorporate that into your mindful breathing exercises. These things can be like stacked on top of each other, or you can do them kind of separately. Really depends on like what works for you. But let me introduce the body scan, the concept of this. So the body scan is really, again, tuning in exercise to check in with not just your breathing, but like what's going on in our body. And we can use the breath and kind of send the breath to specific areas of our body to engage in more of a kind of like specific relaxation response. So this diagram is pretty self-explanatory, but you get comfortable in your seat, just like we did to start the breathing meditation. close your eyes, you focus on the breath, right? So you do that first kind of grounding and tune in. And then what we do is we start to bring our awareness to a specific part of our body. And I actually do this a lot when I do mindful meditations with clients, is that I will have them start with a baseline body scan so that they can pay attention to and notice, okay, where did I start? And did anything shift and change by the end of the, couple minutes that we did the deep breathing? So think of yourself as kind of like when you're doing a body scan, those those like TSA scanners in the airport, and it's like and it kind of like takes a picture of your body. You're doing that basically. You're going from head to toe or toe to head, usually it's head to toe, but either way works. And basically just checking in, like what is my body feeling? What am I experiencing? Am I holding specifically like tension in any particular area that while I'm doing the deep breathing, I want to focus on relaxing those areas of my body, right? So you spend a couple seconds doing your scan and you go from head to toe. You just kind of take an observation of like, okay, I carry a lot of stress in my shoulders and I'll kind of like tense up. And so I might notice as I'm doing my scan, okay, yeah, my shoulders are feeling a little tense. Okay. And then I keep going down through the different areas of my body and I'm like, okay, I'm a little hungry too, and that's okay. It's almost dinner time, I'm a little tired. My legs are a little tired. I had kind of a long run yesterday. That's okay. But okay, so what I want to do is I want to focus my energies in this specific exercise on those places, and especially like the tension I might be holding in my shoulders. You can also, as you're scanning, kind of notice if there's any, not just like physical experience, but sometimes we hold emotion in our bodies too, right? So again, like stress, tension is not just kind of like muscle tension, can be, but sometimes it can be like stress, anxiety. You're like, oh my gosh, my stomach is churning because I'm, have an exam later today. So focusing on those areas of your body, and then as you're breathing, those out breaths, those relaxing out breaths, if we kind of visualize the breath going into those areas of our body and then breathing, like calming, relaxing vibes into those areas of our body, and then the out breath. And then at the end of that exercise, what you do is you kind of go through and you do another body scan and you notice, has anything shifted? Has anything changed? Is your tension a little bit less? Ideally, it should be. So that's the idea of a body scan. It's integrating that kind of bodily awareness into the breathing. You see how they kind of stack and relate to one another. PMR is another mindfulness and relaxation technique that you can, again, stack with body scanning and deep breathing. Progressive muscle relaxation, or PMR, is a specific form of therapy that involves tightening and relaxing your muscle groups one at a time in a specific pattern. So again, similar to that body scan, what we do is we intentionally engage in muscle tightening and then release from head to toe. The goal is to release tension from our muscles while helping you recognize what tension feels like. PMR is often used for anxiety reduction in individual therapy, for panic experiences and panic-like disorders. If you're someone that gets like real amped up and you're like on the edge of panic, either in competition or like before a big exam or having to do public speaking, PMR might be helpful for you. Word of caution, though, is if you have an active injury, I would advise against utilizing PMR because you might aggravate that injury. So like muscle spasms or things like that. But that being said, for more chronic pain disorders and conditions like TMJ, if you have like, if you're someone who stresses a lot and you kind of grind your teeth and you hold tension in your jaw, this could be helpful. Or fibromyalgia, migraines, headache experiences. PMR could be helpful for you. So again, similarly, to when we did the body scan, what you would do is you would kind of go through, first you would ground yourself in your breathing. We always start with that. And then we go through from head to toe and we start kind of in localized areas. So you start with your head, right? So when you're kind of breathing in, for example, you would ground yourself and then you would say to yourself, okay, I'm going to tense them. I'm going to start with my head. I'm going to tense the muscles in my face, and so you would kind of like make a scrunched up face or tense your jaw, hold it for a couple seconds, and then breathe out and then release everything, right? you see a lot of athletes kind of like shake it out, to try to get the jitters out. You could also utilize this, right? Like tense and then shake, if that is helpful for you. So again, it doesn't have to be a full-blown exercise, but it is helpful to do that, to practice it and get your brain and your body used to it. And then, if you need it and bits and pieces of it for relief in competition or before competition, you can adjust it. However works for you. There's again a reference and a resource at the bottom of this page. If you think that an exercise like PMR might be helpful for you and you want to dive into that, please check that out. Visualization. Um, if we were if you were all kind of like engaged in an interactive webinar, I'd be asking you about visualization. Like how many of you have utilized visualization in your lives, in your sport? I'm sure many of you have. I'm sure it's talked about all the time, right? How do we do visualization though in a way that is effective? So we can utilize mindful visualization again to help regulate. Visualization is also called mental imagery. It's essential for sport performance, for like achieving peak performance even. I work with a lot of CEOs too, and like business professionals, and we talk about visualization too. So again, kind of a broad skill set here. But you're basically seeing with the mind's eye or hearing with the mind's ear. Um, Thanks for putting that in the chat, Anthony. So when visualizing, you're having a very vivid visual sensory experience in your mind without utilizing your eyes. Do you remember back a couple slides ago when I mentioned with the stress response, how we have these kind of reptilian brains? Our brains, what's interesting about our brains is our brains don't differentiate between imagined scenarios that cause stress and actual scenarios. So like if you're being chased down an alleyway, or historically, right, like caveman days, if we were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, our bodies and our brains respond in the exact same way as if we're experiencing stress around like sending an email, maybe a difficult email or something, something that causes you stress that is kind of like more in your head. So interesting, right? And research has shown that visualization recruits the same brain areas that actual seeing does. So similarly to that kind of stress response, visualization does the same thing, right? The imagined experiences can also activate the brain in the same way that like actual experiences do. It's super interesting. Several ways to engage in visualization. Meditation practices. So if you'd like to establish a formal meditation practice, there's tons of resources out there. You could Google that and a million things will pop up. Having a structured meditation practice can be helpful. It's not necessary in order to kind of benefit from mindfulness, though. It's just one way of practicing it that's more structured and formal. Performance rehearsal is another type of visualization. Vision boards, I mean, this time of year, we're at the end of January now, but vision boards in January tend to be pretty popular, kind of like envisioning the things that you want to achieve, setting goals, and then kind of like imagining them and kind of like putting it out into the universe, right? So that we're kind of keeping it front of mind. That's a good way of engaging in visualization if you're like a creative person, you like Pinterest or, being creative, have at it. And then there's another example called mind mapping that I can send links to if you want, but mind mapping is kind of like creating a spider web, starting with your like main goal and visualizing all the offshoots of that goal. So it's like a combination of visualization, mindfulness, and goal setting. It's kind of creating the spider web of goals and how they kind of break down into smaller goals, process goals, that kind of thing. So um, we won't get into the specifics of visualization today. If you would like to do that, we could create a whole webinar on just that. And I'd be happy, or I'm sure other Mindflow professionals would be happy, clinicians would be happy to dive into the specifics of visualization. But if you just want to kind of dabble in it and kind of tweak your practice, if you're actively using visualization or performance rehearsal, these are two really great references on how to do that. The thing with visualization and performance rehearsal is that you want to make it as vivid as possible. And so when you're utilizing visualization, you want to make sure that you're invoking all of your senses in your mind, right? So you want to think through not just you don't want to just kind of like see it play out like a movie, on a screen in your brain, but you want to really kind of invoke and like describe in your mind what's happening, set the scene. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you smelling? What are you tasting? What are you feeling? Right? Like describing, utilizing all of your senses to really make it a very vivid experience. The more vivid you make it, the more areas of the brain get activated and the visualization becomes just like a little bit more powerful that way. So if you'd like to kind of read through these or utilize these, I highly recommend both of these examples and the techniques here. The last topic with mindfulness, and then we'll leave some space for Q&A, is mindfulness of thoughts. So, we talked about the mind-body connection. We talked a little bit about emotion regulation, physiological regulation. Now, what about thoughts, right? Like we can apply mindfulness and the concepts of mindfulness to harnessing and creating a mindful mindset. And again, this is a topic that we can carry into a whole nother webinar if you're interested. This is particularly helpful if you tend to get hooked into negative thoughts, right? If mistakes, errors, flubs, that kind of thing tend to really get to you. And then it's like you cannot get out of your own head. Mindfulness might be a helpful tool for you. If you're someone that is just trying to develop more of a positive mindset, mindfulness might be helpful for you, right? So mindfulness of current thoughts. Again, this is gonna sound familiar. If you remember that definition of mindfulness from the first slide or second slide, how do we do this? How do we bring our awareness gently to what's going on in between our ears, right? First, we observe. The way I like to describe applying mindfulness to our cognitions, our thoughts, is pretending that you are a scientist of your own experiencing. Good scientists don't judge, they don't involve bias, right? All they do is collect the data and observe. That's the key here. So where you're going to start is first you're going to start again to tune in. So you can take a breath and try to calm down and hear what's happening. Like actually, actively tune in to the thoughts, the self-talk, the chatter, the mental chatter that's going on. Observe your thoughts like waves coming and going, right? Gently, not analyzing it, just be like, interesting. I'm having a thought that blah, 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 right? So you can utilize that language. I'm having a thought. Oh, interesting. Oh, I'm hearing that I'm saying this to myself, right? That very objective language. Do you hear the difference between kind of getting hooked into the thought or saying like, oh, I'm so stupid, or why did I do that? Or, that self-critical language. Instead, you would say, oh, I'm noticing that I'm having a thought that I am calling myself stupid for doing X, Y, and Z, or for saying that thing that I wish I wouldn't have said, right? So you notice it and you use observational and mindful language. The goal here is to not suppress thoughts, right? Like we can't do that. Like the thoughts are going to come regardless. There's no kind of control of the wave of thoughts that come and go. Just notice them as they're coming and going. And not trying to like get hooked into any one thought either, right? So the thoughts again are going to come and go. Adopting a curious mindset. That's the second part, right? So if you're going to suspend judgment and criticalness to reduce negative thoughts, negative chatter, we adopt this curious observational mindset. Ask yourself, where's that coming from, right? Let's just watch and see it. Again, being a scientist of your own cognitive experiencing, noticing that every thought comes and goes, right? That first slide, I don't know if you noticed back at the beginning, but there was a really pretty slide with a picture of a surfer on it. I did that intentionally. We call this kind of like mindfulness of thoughts, thought surfing, right? We just kind of ride the waves, right? Some waves are big, some waves feel like they can, like tidal waves because they feel like they overwhelm us. The goal of mindfulness is to ride the wave, knowing that they ebb and they flow, right? We just kind of find a rhythm with them. And yeah, some waves do feel overwhelming, but eventually they all subside, right? So that was the imagery there, the purpose of that one. But we adopt this curious mindset where we just kind of go with the flow. We notice the thoughts, we observe, we let go of judgments. And then remembering that we're not our thoughts, right? So when we're starting to get hooked into a negative mindset, being able to kind of like take that mental step back, right? Creating space in between our thoughts and our experiencing of it, because we know that our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors are all intricately connected, right? And if we don't slow that down, the negative thoughts turn into anxiety, turn into, like behavior that then we're not, again, our performance starts to dwindle. So, if we don't kind of stop that and try to slow it down with mindfulness in terms of like where our thoughts start, we can easily get carried away. So remembering we're not our thoughts, we can create some space. And reminding ourselves that like catastrophic thinking is really just kind of in our heads, right? It's like it's engaging what we would call in dialectical behavior therapy the emotion mind. Um, so mindfulness again is engaging that prefrontal cortex instead of the amygdala so that we're not getting carried into and away with the emotion. Make sense? Hopefully. Okay. So again, how do we put this into practice? What might that whole concept, right? Sounds really good. How do I use it? Let's put it into play. So mindfulness of thoughts, how do we do this? A couple suggestions here, and this is not a be all end all list. These are just some suggestions that I find to be helpful, things that are kind of easy to do, make sense. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the power of yet. Using the word yet in our language can be very powerful, right? Like, oh, I can't do it. I can't do it yet, right? Um, Super powerful, right? It still opens the door to growth rather than shutting that down and then kind of like encouraging negativity. So being mindful of our chatter when we hear it, we can add that word yet to it. Okay, I haven't done this. I haven't mastered this yet. And then you can always follow that up with something positive, like reframing it, and I will, right? If you hear yourself, another tip is if you hear in your language as you start to become more mindful of your mental chatter, if you hear yourself using the word but a lot, another suggestion that I don't have on here, but I should have put it on here, is replacing the word but with and, so that you're not kind of canceling opportunities out, you're including more opportunities with the word and. So I haven't mastered this yet, and I will. Way different than some of that other negative chatter, right? Like it gives you more of a growth mindset, reframes things more positively. Another suggestion is once you hear some of this negative chatter, this works for some people, sometimes it doesn't. If you're a tough love person, maybe this is up your alley, but you can engage in thought stopping. Basically, it's telling yourself to just knock it off, right? So like, okay, I'm hearing it again, knock it off. No, nope, not going to do it, right? We're done, stop, just stop. So sometimes if that's helpful to just kind of like jolt yourself into or out of like a negative mindset, hey, go for it. Cognitive reframing. This can sometimes be a little bit tricky, but in the end, super helpful. So turning your negatives into positives, doing it like a 180 with your thoughts is not the easiest because a lot of people will be like, well, it's not that believable, right? Like if I'm used to thinking negatively, if I just turn that around, like I'm not really going to believe it. It doesn't really have the same kind of emphasis or power. Over time, it might, but sometimes we have to make a step in between and we might have to reframe our thoughts into something more neutral, right? So that yet that's where you might use that. So we might engage in kind of neutral thinking, and then over time we might reframe a negative thought into a positive thought. But keep that in mind. If you're starting to recognize there's some patterns of thoughts that tend to be more negative in the way that you think, on or off the court or field, find a step in between, right? It doesn't have to do a full 180. And I do have a handout for you on this. It's turning your negative critic into a positive coach. So and I'll show you that in a second. And that'll be a handout that'll get sent to you. But it'll walk you like step by step through an exercise of how you might do that. Another thing is if you start to notice in your thinking, as you're bringing more mindfulness to your thoughts, if you start to notice the word should, that's another indicator that the negative mindset is kind of taking hold, right? Like, oh, I should have done this, or I shouldn't do that, or I could have done this, could have done that. Um, there's a famous psychologist who founded a form of therapy called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. His name's Albert Ellis, and he would call that, and this is a funny phrase intentionally, but he would call that shoulding all over yourself. So if you hear yourself shoulding all over yourself, using the word should a lot, being your own worst critic, right? Notice it gently and try to take a step back from that, trying to use some more like gentle reframes, like, okay, I'm okay. It's going to be okay. And this leads into coping statements, right? Sometimes simple coping statements like, I'm okay. It's going to be okay. Everything works out in the end. I know I have the resources to be able to do hard things. I do hard things all the time, right? Like I'm used to grinding things out. I'm no stranger to difficulty, right? Coping statements can also be helpful. Most of the time, it helps us talk us off the ledge, right? Like when we start to kind of like get too activated again, we're on that down slope, and performance might start to dwindle. Coping statements can kind of halt it and bring us back into a place where like, okay, now I can use some more regulation. Like I can use some more breathing now once I've talked myself off the ledge, and then maybe even engage in some other strategies like positive reframes. Um, you might also shift to instructional self-talk. If you hear yourself talking negatively or getting caught in a negative thought spiral, okay, go back to being like your own coach in your head. So examples of this might be like, okay, I just need to tell myself like, what am I doing right now? So take a breath. What am I doing right now? Where should my feet be in the batter's box? Where are my hands? Quick feet, being more instructional and telling your body and your brain what you should be doing and where you should be going. Because again, once you start thinking that, you're not going to be thinking the negative things. So if you shift your mindfulness of thoughts to things that are more instructional self-talk, that might be another way to kind of like break it up, right? And then creating mantras, right? I'm sure many of you have used motivating quotes, things like that, have them hanging on your lockers or, in your rooms, whatever, in the locker room. Creating motivating mantras, something that feels personal to you is really important, right? So if there's somebody else's quote that kind of lights your fire, great. If you can create one for yourself, maybe even better. And there's another handout on that one too, on how to walk you through if you're interested in creating something that feels like maybe more personal for you, that can be more positive, like, or maybe even a couple of them, like having a handful of them in your back pocket is great. But creating a couple like positive things for you to fall back on, especially when you're having a hard day or you're like kind of having the yips or whatever, right? All the tools in the toolbox. Like, let's arm yourself. Let's put these things in your back pocket. So these are the handouts that you will receive, as I mentioned, turning your negative critic into a positive coach. It's a pretty self-explanatory worksheet. You can walk yourself through it. And then the mantra developing something that sticks. So it'll go through some kind of brain dump, some prompts, thinking just to kind of get like the juices flowing, get your brain going. And then you'll develop your mantra in step 2, utilizing kind of the visualization essentially with the prompts above that you just did. And then you'll come up with some ideas of things that you can kind of like say to yourself or remind yourself of. So that is all I have for you, and we'll leave some time for Q&A, but I just want to thank you all for being here. So any questions, feel free to shoot.
And one thing I'll highlight, I know Megan showed a bunch of different spreadsheets and different forms and different things along those lines that you all can use on your own time. I'll send those to everybody after the fact so you can have those in hand. But to kick things off, I've got one question that I think is very, very relatable for athletes is why is it so hard to practice mindfulness in the heat of the moment, and how can I overcome this?
Yeah, so in the heat of the moment, right? Like we get carried away, right? Pretty easily, right? Like the amygdala, right? Like our emotions are already going, right? Our brains are already going. It's instinctual, right? And so in the heat of the moment, we kind of just lose track, right? Of being mindful. And that's why practicing it outside of sport. It's just like, doing train. It's just like having to do lift sessions and, like off-season training, right? Like we have to kind of flex these mental muscles outside of those times that we need them the most in order for them to be the most effective. So developing a mindfulness-based practice outside of sport. Heck, if you're walking to and from class, and that's a perfect time. You're not doing anything but walking, maybe listening to some music, right? But you can even do like mindful walking, which is like tuning into your surroundings, doing that deep breathing, right? Integrate it in easy ways. I know student athlete life is hectic, right? You're going every which way direction. Most hours of your day are scheduled for you, right? Finding simple ways. And that's why I go back to like the breathing as like the easiest, simplest, most effective and accessible way of practicing mindfulness. Find ways of integrating it even in small moments in your day-to-day life on your walk to and from class, those couple moments when you're sitting in the locker room right before you, leave, take your deep breaths, like do the intentional breathing. Yeah, right before bed, right? Or right when you wake up in the morning while you're eating your cereal. Like it can be anytime, anywhere, but like the intentional part, right? Like building it in intentionally, even in small doses, adds up over time.
Well said. We've got one more in hand, and if somebody out there has another question, please feel free to send it in. So how can mindfulness help my athletic performance?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, right, like you're regulating your body, right? You're regulating your emotions and you're more in control of your thoughts. If you can, like, imagine if all of those things kind of fall into place, how much how much more flow do you think you would, and how much more fun do you think you would have, right? If you were kind of like in the moment, like letting yourself be in the moment as you're competing, as you're playing, right? Like it helps with not overthinking, as I mentioned, right? Like once you start to kind of overanalyze, you get the paralysis by analysis, right? You kind of like get into your brain and then all of a sudden you're like, herky jerky with like, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? Right. And you kind of almost like forget. It's like your muscle memory goes right out the window. Mindfulness can help with that because, um, we're intentionally kind of like in the here and now, right? We're more regulating of our emotions, as we mentioned, throughout our conversation today. We can take that kind of gentle step back and feel like we have more control rather than it controlling us, right? That's the goal, right? With mindfulness and with really all the work that I do is kind of helping people insert this like little mental pause into the things that they're doing in their everyday life, in their sport, in their work, right? Inserting this little pause to give them more opportunities to be proactive rather than reactive. And I think that's really important, right? Like as an athlete, you always want to be proactive. You want to be like one step ahead in the moment, but like one step ahead of your opponent, right? We don't want to fall into a place where we're being reactive. We want to feel like we have control. And I think mindfulness can do that.
Lovely. Well, we've got one more, and we've got time for one more, and apologies if we can't get to any other questions, but this is a really good one, and I think this can apply to everyone. That for me, I have a hard time practicing mindfulness because sometimes it feels like a waste of time because I can't physically see the results. Any tips for this? Great question.
Yeah. 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 That is a tough one, right? Especially like athletes are outcome driven people, right? We focus on the stats, we focus on the numbers, we focus on the wins. And it can be difficult to shift our focus to being to something that's more process oriented. If you're someone that likes to see the physiological outcomes, I know a lot, not all schools, but a lot of schools have either embedded within their psychology departments, their biology and neuroscience departments, or even sometimes in their counseling departments, they might have biofeedback centers. So I would look into where you're going to school or what resources are available to you, because biofeedback is a really good way of being able to see in real time what a mindfulness practice is doing for your body. So for example, like you would be hooked up to like a heart rate monitor. Like usually there's like a little finger pulse monitor. And as you're doing these mindful exercises, there's a screen in front of you and you can see, right, that you're all of a sudden your heart rate becomes a little bit more regulated and you're like, oh yeah, okay. And there's some visualization components with that. There's a whole program called heart math that I used to use in my practice, and now since I'm more teletherapy based, I don't really get to use it as much, but I used to use it a lot with athletes, mostly for training around performance anxiety. So we would kind of use visualization and the deep breathing and the heart rate regulation, and they would physically see on these screens how the exercises work for them. It takes time. That's the other thing too, is I think we have to remind ourselves that it's not going to happen overnight. Doing, like one meditative practice a week is not going to do it. In fact, a lot of the mindfulness-based stress reduction programs are like 8, 12 weeks long, and people are, encouraged to have a mindfulness practice that's at least 5 to 10 minutes a day. And over that course of 8 to 12 weeks, they do see changes in the brain. They do brain scans and they see that different areas of the brain are lighting up and other areas are not after a practice of mindfulness. Um, so it takes time, patience, right? You might not see it right away. And in fact, some of these skills, if you're utilizing them in the heat of the moment, might not do anything for you, right? Because sometimes the heat of the moment is just too overwhelming. And by that point, we might be too far gone. So don't discount that they aren't, that they won't work or that they can't work. It takes time. It takes practice. It's deliberate. It's intentional. Um, there was one other thing I wanted to say about that, about measuring it. Oh, it might be helpful too. I mean, there's lots of other ways that you could quantify it. You might need to get creative with it, but if you start a mindfulness practice, um, you can find a way of kind of like measuring it for yourself, just like you would measure any of the other things that you do with like, in the weight room or, skills, in your sport. You could start with kind of like identifying a couple things, right off the bat, or like journaling, right? Like I guess self-monitoring via journaling would be another way. It's like you could use a journal and over time you could notice, maybe I'm noticing like my overall stress is going down. Alternatively, if you want to work with a psychologist, we could help you. We could help you measure it for you if you don't have any kind of like tools, or if you're like kind of grasping at straws with like how do I measure this? Like how do I see an outcome? We have ways of doing that. We have self-report measures, and just over time will help you kind of identify ways in which um these skills are helpful for you. But yeah, I think you have to give it time.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for all of this important and practical content. This is incredible. Thank you all for being here. Like I said, I will send everybody who attended this webinar not only the recording of this webinar, but also the forms that Megan alluded to, so that you guys can put this into practice. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways is this takes time, this takes practice, takes reps, just like anything else in life and especially within your sport. So thank you all very much. I hope you all have a great night. Thank you again, Megan. I'll turn it
Thank you.
over to you for closing remarks.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you guys for being here. Again, we just did the basics of mindfulness. If you would like more of this and you want to get into like a mindfulness practice, let us know. Shoot Anthony an email. We'd be happy to do like a mindfulness 2.0, mindfulness of thoughts, putting it into practice, developing a mindfulness based, like integrating it into my sport, finding a way of being more practical with it. Whatever you feel like would be helpful, let us know. I'd be happy to expand on the topic. But thank you all for being here. I hope you found it helpful. Let us know if you have any questions. Good luck with your seasons.
All right. We'll see you all next time. Be
All
well.
right. Bye.